Chapter 5. Every clock tower in St. Petersburg that showed and told the hour was striking exactly midnight when Mr. Golyakin, beside himself, ran on to the Fontaka embankment. Near that same Izmailovsky bridge, seeking refuge from his enemies, from persecution, from the insults that had rained down on him, from the shrieks of frightened old ladies, from the sobbing and sighing of women, and from Andrei Filipovich's murderous glances. Mr. Golyakin was crushed, and absolutely crushed in the full sense of the word. And if he still had the ability to run at that moment, it was solely by some miracle. A miracle in which he himself refused to believe. It was a dreadful November night, dank, misty, raining, snowing, a night fraught with colds, fevers, agues, quinsys, and inflammations of every conceivable variety and description, and brief, fraught with all the blessings of a St. Petersburg November. The wind howled down the deserted streets, raising the black waters of the Fontanka above the mooring rings, and rattling with a vengeance the feeble lanterns along the embankment, which echoed its howling with those shrill, ear-splitting squeaks that make up the endless... Too many flies here. The endless concert of jarring sounds so very familiar to every inhabitant of St. Petersburg. It was raining and snowing at the same time. Sheets of rain, broken up by the wind, sprayed about almost horizontally, as if from a fire hose, stabbing and stinging the face of the hapless Mr. Golyakin like 1,000 pins and needles, amidst the stillness of the night, interrupted only by the distant rumble of carriages. The howling of the wind and the squeaking lanterns could be heard, the mournful sound of water gushing and gurgling from every roof, porch, gutter, and cornice onto the granite pavement. There was not a soul to be seen, either far or near. It seemed there could not possibly be at such an hour and such weather. And so only Mr. Golyakin, alone in his despair, was trotting along the Fontanka at this time of night, taking his usual rapid, short steps, hurrying to reach his fourth-floor flat in Shestilavonaya Street as soon as he possibly could. The longest name ever. Shestilavonaya Street. Although the rain, the snow, and everything that does not even have a name, when a blizzard rages and thick fog comes down on a St. Petersburg November night, were suddenly of one accord attacking Mr. Golyakin, who was crushed enough by misfortune, allowing him not the least protection or respite, chilling him to the marrow, gluing up his eyes, gusting from all sides, driving him off his path and out of his mind. And although all this descended on Mr. Golyakin at once, as if deliberately conspiring with his enemies to give him a day, evening and night he would never forget, despite all this, Mr. Golyakin remained almost unaffected by this final proof of a fate that was pursuing him. So thoroughly shaken and stunned was he by all that had happened to him a few minutes earlier as State Councilor Baron Deyevs. If any disinterested outside observer had now casually glanced from the side at Mr. Golyakin in his wretched flight, he would have at once fathomed the whole awful horror of his tribulations, and would doubtless have said that Mr. Golyakin now looked like a man wanting to hide, wanting to run away from himself. Yes, that really was the case. Let us say more. Now, Mr. Golyakin not only wanted to escape from himself, but even hide from himself, to be utterly annihilated, to exist no more and turn to dust. At that moment, he was oblivious of everything around, understood nothing that was happening around him, and he looked as if all the nastiness of that foul night, the long walk, the rain and the wind and the snow, did not, in fact, exist for him. One galosh, having parted company with Mr. Golyakin's right foot, was left behind in the slush and snow on the Fontanka pavement, but Golyakin didn't even consider going back for it, and didn't even notice he had lost it. He was so perplexed that several times, despite all that was surrounding him, he would suddenly stop short and stand stock still in the middle of the pavement, completely obsessed by the thought of this recent appalling fall from grace. At those moments he would die, he would vanish. Then he would suddenly tear off again like one demented and run without looking back, as if escaping pursuit or some even more dreadful calamity. His predicament was truly shocking. At length, his strength exhausted, Mr. Golyakin stopped, leaned over the embankment railing like a man with a sudden nosebleed, and stared intently at the dark, murky waters of the Fontanka. There is no knowing exactly how long he spent in this occupation. All that is known is that at that moment, Mr. Golyakin plumbed such depths of despair, was so tormented, harassed, exhausted, so bereft of any spark of fortitude, so disheartened that he had forgotten everything. Izmailovsky Bridge, Shestilavonaya Street, and his present plight. But what did it matter, really? He couldn't have cared less. Everything was all over, signed, settled, and sealed. Why should he fret over it? Suddenly he shuddered all over and instinctively leaped a couple of steps sideways. With an indescribable feeling of uneasiness, he started looking around, but no one was there. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened, and meanwhile, he felt that someone had been standing right beside him just then. His elbows similarly propped on the railings, and amazing to relate, had even said something to him abruptly and hurriedly, not altogether intelligibly, but about something very familiar to him and which concerned him. Well, now, have I imagined all this? Mr. Goliakin asked himself, looking around again. But where am I standing? He concluded, shaking his head, and meanwhile peering with an anxious, dejected feeling, even fearfully, into the wet, murky distance, straining his short-sighted eyes as hard as he could, and doing his utmost to penetrate the sodden gloom that stretched before him. However, there was nothing new, nothing in particular caught by Mr. Goliakin's eye. Everything appeared to be in order, and as it should have been. That is, the snow was falling even harder and thicker in larger flakes. Nothing was visible at 20 paces. The lantern squeaked even more shrilly than before, and the wind seemed to be singing its melancholy song even more mournfully and plaintively than ever. Like some inopportune beggar pleading for a few kopecks for food. What on earth's the matter with me? Mr. Goliakin repeated, setting off again and constantly looking around slightly. Meanwhile, some new sensation took complete possession of his whole being. Not really anguish, not really fear. A feverish tremor ran through his every sinew. It was an unbearably nasty moment. Well, it's nothing, he muttered to encourage himself. It's nothing. Perhaps it's absolutely nothing at all. No stain on anyone's honor. Perhaps it was all meant to be. He continued without understanding himself what he was saying. Perhaps in its own good time, everything will turn out for the best. There will be nothing to complain about, and everyone will be vindicated. Talking in this way and calming himself with these words, Mr. Goliakin gave himself a little shake, shook off the snowflakes that had been forming a thick crust on his hat, collar, overcoat, scarf, boots, on everything in fact, but he still couldn't brush aside or rid himself of that strange, vague feeling of anguish. Somewhere far off, the sound of a cannon rang out. What weather, thought our hero. Just listen to that. Could it be a flood warning? Clearly the water is dangerously high. No sooner had Mr. Goliakin said or thought this than he saw a passerby walking towards him, most likely someone delayed for some reason himself. It was all of little consequence. It would seem a chance encounter, but for some mysterious reason, Mr. Goliakin became alarmed, afraid even, and he felt somewhat at a loss. It wasn't that he feared that it might be some nasty character, while perhaps, who knows who this belated person could be, flashed through his mind. Perhaps he's part of the same thing. Perhaps he's the most important person in this business, and he's not here for nothing, but has a purpose in coming and crossing my path and bumping into me. But perhaps Mr. Goliakin did not think precisely that, and had only a fleeting impression of something resembling it, extremely unpleasant. Yet there was no time for thinking or even feeling. The passerby was already within a couple of strides, as was his invariable habit. Mr. Goliakin wasted no time in assuming a very special look. Yet there was no time. Mr. Goliakin did not think precisely that and had only a fleeting impression of something resembling it and extremely unpleasant. Yet there was no time for thinking or even feeling. The passerby was already within a couple of strides, as was his invariable habit. Mr. Goliakin wasted no time in assuming a very special look, a look that clearly expressed that he, Mr. Goliakin, was minding his own business, that he was all right, that the street was wide enough for everyone, and that indeed he, Mr. Goliakin, was bothering no one. Suddenly he stood rooted to the spot as if struck by lightning, and swiftly turned around after the stranger who had just passed him turned around as if someone had tugged him from behind and turned him as the wind swings a weathercock. The passerby was fast disappearing into the snowstorm. He too was in a hurry like Mr. Goliakin. He too was wrapped up from head to foot. He too was pattering along the Fonteca pavement with the same rapid short steps and at a slight trot. What's this? Whispered Mr. Goliakin with an incredulous smile, yet trembling in every limb. Cold shivers ran down his spine. Meanwhile, the passerby had disappeared completely, and his footsteps could no longer be heard, but Mr. Goliakin still stood there, gazing after him. Gradually, though, he finally came to his senses. What's on earth's going on? What on earth's going on? He thought irritably. Have I gone mad? Really gone mad? He turned and went on his way, quickening his stride the whole time, and trying his level best to avoid thinking of anything at all. To this end, he even closed his eyes. Suddenly, through the howling of the wind and noise of the storm, he again heard the sound of someone's footsteps very close by. He started and opened his eyes. Ahead of him, about 20 paces away, the small dark figure of a man was rapidly approaching. This little man was in a hurry, rushing along with short, rapid steps. The distance between them was rapidly diminishing. Now, Mr. Goliakin could clearly make out his new belated companion. Made him out completely, and he shrieked with horror and bewilderment. His legs gave away. It was that very same passerby, already familiar to him, from whom he had made way and passed 10 minutes earlier, who had now appeared before him, again quite unexpectedly. But it was not only this marvel that startled Mr. Goliakin, and Mr. Goliakin was so startled that he stopped, cried out, tried to say something, then he raced off in pursuit of the stranger, even shouting out to him to stop as quickly as possible. The stranger did indeed stop about 10 paces from Mr. Goliakin, so that the light of a nearby street lamp fell fully on his whole figure. He stopped and turned to Mr. Goliakin, and with an anxious and impertinent look, waited to hear what Mr. Goliakin had to say. "Forgive me, I seem to have been mistaken," our hero said in a quavering voice. Without a word, the stranger turned away in a huff and swiftly went on his way, as if hurrying to make up the few seconds wasted over Mr. Goliakin. As for Mr. Goliakin, he was trembling in every fiber. His knees weakened and buckled beneath him, and he squatted on a bollard, groaning. And in fact, he had very good reason to feel so distressed. The fact was, the stranger now seemed somehow familiar. That in itself wouldn't have mattered, but he recognized him. But he almost completely recognized that man now. He often seen that man at some time, quite recently even. Where could it have been? Could it have been yesterday? However, the important thing wasn't that Mr. Goliakin had often seen him, and there was hardly anything special about that man. Certainly no one would have given him a second look, so he was like anyone else, like all respectable people, of course, and probably even possessed with some quite special qualities. In short, he was an individual in his own right. Mr. Goliakin didn't feel either hatred or even open hostility, not the slightest enmity towards him. Quite the opposite, it would seem. And this circumstance was the essential thing. And yet, not for all the tea in the China would he have wanted to meet him, particularly not to meet him as just now, for example. We shall say more. Mr. Goliakin knew that man extremely well. He even knew what he was called, his surname. But at the same time, not for all the tea in China would he have wanted to name him or agree to admit that, in a manner of speaking, that's what he was called. Christian name, patronymic, and surname. Whether Mr. Goliakin's confusion was long-lasting or brief, or whether he squatted for long on that bollard, I cannot say. Only that, finally recovering slightly, he suddenly haired off as fast as he could without looking back, with all the strength he could muster. His lungs were bursting. Twice he stumbled and nearly fell, and as a result of this event, Mr. Goliakin's other boot was orphaned, also abandoned by his galosh. Finally, Mr. Goliakin slackened his pace a little to catch his breath, took a hurried look around, and saw that he'd already run. Without noticing it, the whole way along, the Fontanka had crossed Ani Cove Bridge, had gone down part of the Nevsky Prospect, and was now standing at the junction with Lightnaya Street. Mr. Goliakin turned into Lightnaya Street. The situation at that moment was like that of a man on the brink of a terrifying precipice, when the ground is giving away beneath him. It is moving and rocking, it quakes, it sways for the last time, it falls, drawing him towards the abyss, which the poor wretch has neither the strength nor the fortitude to leap back from, or to avert his eyes from the yawning chasm. The abyss is drawing him on, and finally he himself leaps into it, thus hastening his own demise. Mr. Goliakin knew and felt, and was perfectly convinced that some new evil would overtake him on his way, that more unpleasantness was bound to erupt over his head, that, for instance, he might again encounter that stranger. But strange to relate, he positively longed for that meeting, considering it inevitable, and all he asked was that the whole thing should be over and done with, that his position should be decided quickly, one way or the other. So as long as it was soon, meanwhile on and on he ran, as if propelled by some external force, for he felt a growing weakness and numbness in his whole being. He couldn't think of anything, although his mind clutched at everything like blackthorn. A wretched stray dog, wet and shivering, attached itself to Mr. Goliakin and hurried along beside him, his tail between his legs and his ears laid back, looking up at him every now and then, timidly and intelligently. Some remote, long-forgotten idea, the memory of something that had happened long ago, now entered his head, tapping away like a small hammer in his brain, vexing him and not leaving him in peace. "Ugh, that nasty little cur," Mr. Goliakin whispered, not understanding what he was saying. At length he caught sight of his stranger at the corner of Italy-Yanskaya Street. Only this time the stranger wasn't coming towards him, but was also running in the same direction, a few steps ahead. At last they turned into Shistila-Vaknaya Street. It took Mr. Goliakin's breath away. The stranger had stopped right in front of the block where Mr. Goliakin lodged. The sound of a bell rang out, and almost at the same time an iron bolt creaked. The gate opened, the stranger stooped, flitted past, and vanished. Almost at the same moment, Mr. Goliakin arrived too and flew through the gates like an arrow. Ignoring the grumbling porter, he ran breathlessly into the courtyard and immediately caught sight of his interesting companion, whom he lost for one moment. Then he glimpsed a stranger at the entrance of the staircase that led to Mr. Goliakin's flat. Mr. Goliakin hurled after him. The staircase was dark, damp, and filthy. Every landing was heaped with all kinds of tenants' rubbish, so that a stranger unfamiliar with the place and have to face that staircase after dark was forced to spend about a half-hour climbing it, risking breaking his legs and cursing his friends together with the staircase for residing in such an inconvenient locality. But Mr. Golyakin's companion seemed to be perfectly at home and familiar with his surroundings, and he ran up easily without any trouble and with a complete knowledge of the topography. Mr. Golyakin almost caught up with him. Once or twice the tail of the stranger's coat even struck his nose, and then his heart missed a beat. The mysterious person stopped right outside the doors of Mr. Golyakin's flat and knocked. At any other time, this would have startled Mr. Golyakin. Petrushka opened the door at once as if he had been waiting up for him and hadn't gone to bed, and followed the man who entered, candle in hand. Quite beside himself, the hero of our tale ran into his abode. Without taking off his hat or coat, he went down the short passage and stopped on the threshold of his room as if thunderstruck. All Mr. Golyakin's worst misgivings were confirmed. All that he had dreaded and guessed at that now taking place in reality. He gasped for breath. His head went round. There was a stranger sitting before him on his own bed, also wearing a hat and a coat, faintly smiling, screwing up his eyes a little, and giving him a friendly nod. Mr. Golyakin wanted to cry out, but he was unable to. He wanted to protest in some way, but his strength failed him. His hair stood on end, and he squatted where he was, insensible with horror, and besides he had good reason. Mr. Golyakin had fully recognized his nocturnal friend. His nocturnal friend was none other than himself. Mr. Golyakin in person, another Mr. Golyakin, but identical to him in every way, in brief, in all respects, what is called his double. All right, that was the end of chapter 5.